George, you're muted.
Start again. There we are. Welcome to the State of Our Faith, Faith Commons program that we are bringing to you today as a special edition in partnership with Faith in Texas. My companion in this work is Nancy Kasten, Rabbi Kasten, and I have been doing this work for, I guess, more than 2 years now. And it's been a great joy to have conversations like this on a regular basis. And today we have 3 special guests who are helping us to introduce a subject matter that is important to us all in the community. We're talking about the road to liberation, how to connect our theology to public life. This is something that has been asked by people in our community all the time as we gather to have different events and as we have experienced in recent times especially issues related to racial justice and to policing and to prisons and how to make our community better. So Nancy, we're grateful that you're here and that we have this opportunity again. Any reflections before we introduce our guests? And you're muted.
Just happy to be involved in continuing State of Our Faith a little bit differently than we had done before. We had been meeting weekly on Sundays for several weeks starting at the beginning of March, and took a little break, and now we're back and we will be doing these special editions on a fairly regular basis. So keep watching your email and our Facebook page to be alerted to these special events.
In some ways, this is a preview and a promotion for an event that's coming up on August the 30th. That is Sunday, the 30th of August, between 2 and 8 p.m., the Road to Liberation that is sponsored by Faith in Texas and Faith Commons. And there'll be much more that we will tell you about that and invite you to learn about as this virtual conference will take you much deeper into the question of how you can be involved in transformative work to build better communities, more inclusive and just communities. And that leads us to our guests for today, all 3 of whom are actively involved in this kind of work in their various places, congregations, and other ways that they are serving. First of all, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce to you the Reverend Camilla Hall Sharp, who is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. She lives now here in Dallas with her spouse and daughter. And she is the co-pastor of the congregation called The Gathering, a womanist church in Dallas. And she is a PhD candidate as well in biblical interpretation and the Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School. We welcome you, Reverend Hall Sharp.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad to have you with us, and your work is so interesting. We're going to have to do a whole State of Our Faith just about that. But let me now introduce Ray Jordan, who is a United Church of Christ ordained pastor who has worked as a public school teacher, a university professor, a nonprofit administrator, he's worked as a corporate trainer, clergy person, and consultant in the areas of conflict management, organizational development, and diversity and inclusion. So he actually embodies intersectionality in every aspect of his life, his academic interests, and his work, and it makes him such an effective preacher, speaker, workshop leader, and facilitator in the areas of difference like race, class, gender, etc., and cultural competency. Maybe the most impressive thing about Ray is that he is the father of 3 and is currently completing his PhD in public policy and social change from Union Institute and University. And he also teaches courses at several local colleges and universities, including SMU, Cedar Valley and Northlake colleges, and the University of Texas at Arlington. So welcome, Ray. We're thrilled to have you with us today.
And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Rabbi Elana Zeleny. She is the very first female rabbi in the conservative movement to lead a congregation in the state of Texas. That's a remarkable achievement, and she works with Rabbis Without Borders, which is a network that emphasizes pluralism, innovation, and service in the rabbinate. These are all hallmarks of her work community-wide. And she grew up in the San Francisco area, has served in Atlanta, and is now in the heartland with us, mixing it up in a place that we think is so representative of America and what it needs, and how we think here in Dallas we can represent something of the future of what our country can be. And we're delighted that she is here. She lives now in Dallas, actually in Richardson, with her spouse and children. And we're so glad to welcome you to the program, Rabbi Zeleny.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to start out. We have a few questions, which I'm going to direct to each of you and then invite your responses. We're going to do that for about half an hour. And then we are inviting questions from our audience, which can be submitted through the chat or through our Facebook Live features. So please submit questions as we go through this first part of our conversation with our panelists. So I'm going to start with Camila and ask you to begin by talking a little bit. So I also just want to appreciate this moment and the fact that we have both white faith leaders and Black faith leaders on this program today. And I don't take that for granted, because I'm only beginning to understand how different my experience as a white person in America has been from people of color in this country. And even though as a Jew, my whiteness is not uncomplicated, it still has offered me a perspective that I am realizing now was very limited. So as we go through, please feel free to call me on any of these questions that seem, limited or rife with misunderstanding, because that's part of what this is all about, to understand each other better and really try to figure out how we can address these issues of oppression and liberation together as one human community. So question number one is, what has happened in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, most recently, but also for the past several years, of course, with Botham Jean and others in our own community here in Dallas. We've become people who are not people of color have become much more aware of the struggles for liberation that people of color have fought in this country continuously. This is not something new. This is something that has been a part of our heritage forever. But the question is, are you seeing, Camila, a difference in your understanding of your own faith's attitude toward liberation in any way changing as a result of some of the more recent awakenings and experiences in our country, and how your tradition addresses liberation? Has that changed at all for you? Is it consistent? How do you understand that?
Okay, for me, I can't speak for everyone. I would say there has been a change in some people's views, but there has been a consistency for me and for a lot of the people who treat Christianity and things of that nature the same. We all view Christianity as a liberation theology, drawing from biblical sources, drawing from our experiences, drawing from experiences as Black people in this country who have been struggling for their liberation since the day they got here, first of all. And even with that, as they were coming to Christianity, there were quite a few Black people who were rejecting anything that was not liberation in the Bible, which is why they rejected certain biblical texts. And so there is a group of, I would say a pretty large group of people who view it as a liberation, but there are a lot of people who hold to what I believe is slaveholder theology, and it's damaging for Black people, it's damaging for not only Black people, it's damaging for human beings and us as a whole. And so you still see some people who cannot let go, Black, white, all, because this is a theology that has been embedded into this country and is seeped into the systems of this country. And so it's an embedded theology that many people cannot break away from. It was interesting to me because my own denomination had conversations about race after George Floyd. And, my question was, why now? Because, people have been, this is not the first unfortunately, this is not the first Black man we've watched the life come up out of him on camera. But it was this moment, that brought this attention, and it did. I believe it brought awareness to some people, but I still don't believe there has been a big shift, a big enough shift. I'll say that. I believe that there has been some people who, again, they finally can even bring themselves to say the words that Black Lives Matter, as opposed to all lives matter or something of that. But I still don't believe there's been enough people in this country to shift their theology to realize that Black lives matter to God. And so Black lives need to matter to all of us. And until we're all free, nobody is really free.
Ray or Elana, do you want to chime in here and talk about your own traditions, the way that your own traditions speak to liberation and how that is connecting to you or maybe disconnecting for you right now in this moment?
So there's this paradox in Jewish theology, which is at our central tenet, we are commanded to do what God asks us to do. So on the one hand, that's not very liberated because we're following a master, right? But on the other hand, when we submit to God's law, what we end up doing is taking care of the collective. And then as a society, we experience tremendous liberation because societies don't thrive because of their economies or their government. Societies thrive because of their morality. And so part of Jewish theology is around this idea of being commanded to do the right thing in order to liberate everyone who's a member of society. And it's been interesting recently, there are Jews who have always identified with the story of liberation because the Exodus from Egypt is one of our central stories. But there are other Jews who say, I'm really more comfortable being the chosen people. And I like telling the narrative that God likes us best and that we have to look out for our own. And so we've seen some pretty bitter divisions, at least in our local community, throughout May, June, and July, as we've discussed race more openly.
Thank you.
And I have been noticing, as you might imagine, this concept or this reality where moments become movements. And it's hard to determine exactly how it happens. This is not, as Reverend Hall Sharp said, this is not the first time we have seen brutality, police brutality specifically, on camera. It is not the first time we saw the bodies of a Black or brown person be misused and abused and devalued, but it seemed to have struck a nerve. And we could wax eloquent, for the rest of our time together on why we think that this is a movement that has sprung from a moment, but it has. One of the things that I have come to realize is that privilege is blinding, whether it's my privilege as a male, whether it's educated middle-class privilege, whether it is white privilege. Privilege is blinding. It puts on blinders. It keeps us siloed, and we only, unless we are intentional, we only see the world through our own lenses. And so this particular moment, this summer, the protest and unrest that have subsequently occurred post the murder of George Floyd, we've seen persons, particularly our white siblings, begin to take off the blinders of privilege and to begin asking, how can I not simply be a good person? I preach a sermon occasionally, Lord, deliver me from good people. Because, you know, all of us think of ourselves as good people. And I serve in a denomination that is predominantly white. The last couple of places I have served, really the last probably 3 or 4 places I have served, have been in predominantly white settings. And every one of my parishioners and colleagues and peers and friends will consider themselves a good person. But it's not enough to simply be a good person. I'm glad that the word anti-racist has entered the lexicon, because that means we are being proactive in dismantling something. Not to be a good person is a little inactive and reactive, and it kind of is an apathetic state where you can just kind of sit back and let the world happen around you, and as long as it's not personally affecting you, then you can be okay with it. But to be an anti-racist means you have to be proactive, you have to be intentional, you have to be engaged. And that is the move that I am noticing, and it's about darn time, some people are saying, but nevertheless, we're in a moment that's become a movement, and I welcome it. But that's some of the shift that I'm seeing, that blinders are falling off and people are beginning to ask some of the really necessary but hard questions.
So one of those hard questions, of course, has been, the question of how our faith leads us on this question of defunding the police, divesting from policing and incarceration. How would you apply your theology, your understanding of what God wants of you, of what your faith tradition wants of you, to this question of, proactivity in regard to policing, incarceration, and whether or not to dismantle that?
Interestingly, you say that. I just think we ought to tell the truth. And if we could kind of pluck ourselves out of our traditions and out of our histories and begin to read whatever our sacred text is with new eyes, or with fresh eyes, I think that we would kind of see things differently. I often say that Jesus, the person, the human being, was an ethnic minority who lived under the oppression of European colonialism. Well, that's a very different kind of Jesus than most people would embrace or would know about. What do you mean he's an ethnic minority? Well, he's Jewish. He's an ethnic minority. What do you mean living in European colonialism? Well, if those who are Christian or who know the Christian story of the Passion, when the folks went to Pontius Pilate and they could not themselves execute Jesus, they had to ask for permission. Well, why did they have to ask for permission? They were living under the Roman Empire. That is a form of European colonialism, the same kind of colonialism that spread across the world. This is who Jesus was. And so when you see Jesus in that realm, you see Jesus as a revolutionary, then it's not a hard stretch to be able to see ourselves as people of Christian faith, for those of us who are, as persons involved in a revolutionary movement, not simply a go to church on Sunday, sing a couple of hymns and smile sweetly and go home to the same old, same old. So Jesus taught a lot about the kingdom of God, which speaks to this new world order, this way of being in the world that is different from the systems of the world that we currently enjoy. So when we think about the kingdom of God, it is really centered in the least of these. It is a way of being and of creating community that worries about the least of our siblings in society. That, by the mere fact of what the kingdom of God is, would almost speak that those of us who are part of it should be antagonistic or at least resistant to empire. And empire is this conjoining of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism that creates a system that marginalizes, exploits, devalues, and dehumanizes for the sake of plantation economics. Now, I know that's a mouthful, right? But as a person of liberatory faith, particularly of liberatory Christian faith, I see that these two systems as being antagonistic. And I see the police, and sometimes the police really get a bad rap, and it's only because they're the lowest hanging fruit of a larger system. The system, this white patriarchal system that exploits and marginalizes and et cetera, the lowest hanging rung on that ladder is law enforcement. They're the ones who enforce the status quo. And so therefore they get a bad rap sometimes because they're the ones who kind of enforce the status quo. And so when you think about defunding, or at least reprioritizing the funding of one's local police, then it wouldn't be that's not a revolutionary idea, or at least it's not a radical idea when you think about the police as being a part of a larger system that seeks to dehumanize and devalue certain people. And so when I place myself in kind of the trajectory of faith, I place myself in that kind of liberatory, revolutionary stream of Christianity that sees Jesus as a liberator and as a revolutionary, pushing back against a world system that exploits, but making space for a beloved community for all people. And so when I think of it that way, do I want to really put my hard-earned money into a system that does what I've explained? Well, of course not. I want to put my money and my tax dollars into something else, something that is more humane.
So let me follow up with a question for Elana, and then you all can talk about this whole issue. But, you know, so much of our faith is also about, you know, fear, what we fear, and how we address our fears. And I think a lot of people are afraid that if we dismantle the traditional forms of correction for people who maybe commit violence or transgress certain norms, that people will be in more danger. How does your understanding of your faith address that question, that conundrum that we have right now?
If you go back to the first story in the Bible, it's the story of creation, when all of humanity is created in the image of God. And it doesn't say, well, only white people are in the image of God and capable of law and order. That is nowhere in the Bible. So if we really believe that every human has the potential to be godly, then I don't understand why we would view one race as more dangerous than another. And the other thing I'll say is, in the Exodus story, there was an opportunity, I can't remember quite after which plague, but Pharaoh said, I'll tell you what, Moses, you can take the men to go and worship your God in the wilderness, but you leave the women and children here. And the men and Moses didn't say, great, you know, we don't want to lose out on this opportunity. We're afraid that if we, wait for everyone to be included, that all of us might have to stay here. They said, no, we are not going to seek our freedom unless we can go as a collective. So those are two pieces of theology that have been guiding me.
Great. So again, what do we do with this whole question and very practical question about divesting, defunding? We're about to have a big conversation about this as the Dallas City Council debates the budget for the coming year. How do we make sure we're safe if we're not giving police the tools they need to keep us safe? How are we safe if we let people out of jails and prisons? How can we maintain our safety? And where does faith begin and end in that question?
So I would say the police, first of all, are not necessarily the ones are not making us safe. Let's start there. The police is not what makes us safe. But even more so, as we are people of faith, all of our traditions have examples where God is telling us to care for the least of these, as Ray was talking about, and care for people. The reason we have violence is because people don't have jobs. That's why we have the amount of violence that we have. People don't have jobs, people don't have housing, people don't have health care. They're acting out of trying to survive. So what happens when, as a community, we put our money out of our faith, in connection with our faith, put our money towards caring for people so that they don't have to commit acts of violence in order to survive? I mean, for people who follow Jesus in the Christian tradition, it says where your treasure is, so is your heart. So is our heart, when we look at the budget of the city, is our heart really at spending that much money into policing the bodies of people? Whereas if we were to reallocate some of these funds, perhaps we can have more jobs for people. Perhaps we can have education for people, or even in cases where there have been victims, how about allocating some more resources towards supporting victims of violence instead of just policing the violence? So I think we're missing, but I think the other thing that must be understood is the history of policing in this country, what it comes out of, how it started as policing Black bodies out of slavery. Until we really make that connection, and also make that connection with our faith and how our faith has addressed or not addressed slavery in this country, I think we continue to have this gap. But I think the first place is fear is not of God. So we can't be living in a state of fear. We have to be a little bit more courageous in our actions and courageous with our faith.
I would also add, one of the teachings in one of our sacred texts is you have to do the work, but you're not obligated to complete it. And so I have a neighbor who is mentally ill, and the police are down the street on a regular basis. And they are not qualified to care for this human being. He is not receiving the compassion and the justice that he needs from them, because that's not what they're trained to do. And so to have this expectation that if we just give the police more money, they'll be able to handle this man whose needs have nothing to do with being policed and everything to do with mental health and social work, I would say that we are expecting too much of someone.
I agree, because much to what Camilla was saying, that there is a direct line from slavery and slave catching, which were the origins of a lot of our state police and some local police forces as well, like the Texas Rangers as an example. They were slave catching patrollers before they were law enforcement. So there's such a direct line from slavery and slave catching and slavery by another name, which end up being convict leasing and sharecropping. If you keep following that line all the way through, you'll find for-profit prisons and the mass incarceration of Black and brown and poor people. That line is unbroken. And in order to have a real an honest conversation about policing in our country, I think most Americans don't understand that history, and we have to begin there. In addition to that, much to what Rabbi Elana was saying, is that when you think about the persons in prisons, number one, I think that for-profit prisons is one of the moral imperatives of our day. For-profit prisons, which are usually the same companies that run for-profit detention centers for immigration. The idea that that there are profiteers, people are profiting off of the destruction of families and the dehumanization of Black and brown bodies, it's sinful, it's disgusting, and it should be a moral imperative for all people of goodwill and conscience. But with the for-profit piece aside, when you take the persons who are in prison, because most of us know, but some of our listeners may not, that we are 25th on the list of population in the country, or in the world rather. but we are number 5 in incarcerated persons. We incarcerate 5 times, 500% more than any other developed nation in the world. That's problematic. That, in addition to the persons being imprisoned, much to what Rabbi Elana was saying, if you take out the mentally ill, the chronically homeless, the drug addicted and substance abuser, and then the persons who were too poor to afford a proper defense, if you take out those people alone, our prisons will be empty. Really. If you take out our mentally ill persons and put them in real treatment, if you take out those who are substance abusers and put them in real treatment, if you take out the chronically homeless and put them in real recovery and treatment, and you relook at the cases of persons who were simply in prison because they were too poor. What does Brian Stevenson say? This country treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent. So if you take out those who basically could not afford a proper defense, and we look at who then is now imprisoned, that takes care of the problem itself. So for our listeners' sake, when we talk about we, meaning people in the activism and other world, talk about defunding the police, please don't be mistaken. We're not talking about abolishing the police, but reprioritizing the money to go into services for the persons I just mentioned, those who really need humanitarian and social services, not prison.
I want to leave ourselves time for questions because I know that there have been many questions that have come through. And I just want to point out, and maybe some of these questions will address it, that one of the really troubling facts is that some religious or faith-based institutions actually, which are nonprofit, but still are being taking on the responsibility of incarcerating and detaining people theoretically for the, because they can do a better job than some of the other organizations, government or for-profit organizations. And I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of, and maybe we'll get to it in some of our questions as we go forward. But George, do you want to help us with some of the questions coming from our audience?
Sure. Actually, a couple of these questions are around the matter of immigration and has to do with the question of how to connect both our local matter of, say, detention of people or incarceration of people with detention and rejecting immigrants and the like. So when you wrestle with sort of what's happening at home and what's happening on the border and globally, is there something in your faith tradition that connects the dots between those two things, that says these are not two matters, this is one matter? How would you answer that question for people who like to keep those things separate and say, yes, say we should be caring for those in our own community, but our country's full, say, for instance?
Sure. If I could speak to that, Dr. Mason, both as a Christian, as a Protestant Christian that relies both on the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament for instruction and guidance and inspiration, from the Hebrew context, there's this concept of welcoming the stranger, and having radical hospitality and extravagant welcome to the stranger among us. In fact, if you read the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, unlike the popular misnomer, it had nothing to do with sexuality, but it had to do with the abusive treatment of the stranger among us. That, coupled with the New Testament Christian understanding, there's a particular a scripture in the New Testament, I believe it was Paul writing, if I'm mistaken, please forgive me, where he says, be careful how you entertain strangers among you. You might be entertaining angels unawareingly. I often say, be careful how you entertain strangers or strange ones or strange things among you. So in addition to Black liberation theology, a part of my wheelhouse is queer theology as well, from the Christian perspective. And it's this idea that the thing that is different, that is odd, that is foreign to you, whether it be a place or a thing or a person. And to me, this is the heart of implicit bias, whether it is the bias against brown immigrants or whether it is the bias against unarmed Black women and men in police encounters. This idea that that thing that is different from us, that is strange, that somehow we have created other in our psyche, that if we can really make someone other, then you can do all kinds of horrible things to them, like put their children in cages, right? So to me, it is the same issue, just different sides of the coin. And my faith says that, or those who are different or strange to me, ought to be embraced with hospitality and welcome, and not belittled or diminished in some way.
Camila, let me follow up with you about this, picking up on another question about intersectionality in dismantling racism. So, you know, you are a pastor of a womanist congregation, which is to say, there is a unique perspective and experience of Black women in reading scripture, in recognizing their own social location, even different from feminist theology, say. And so there is a kind of unique perspective that happens that we must honor with each social location. And yet, we can't get stuck in our silos, right? We have to be able to draw upon those to be advocates beyond, just as Ray was talking about, how we need to welcome the stranger, how we need to move beyond. So talk a little bit about this notion of intersectionality and how recognizing your own privilege in an area, even where there's oppression, is an important part of getting to the solution.
You said, I didn't hear the last part. Recognizing your what?
Recognizing that, you know, even though we all have our certain ways of experiencing our own oppression or our own need for liberation, there are other ways in which we might have privilege that we need to use on behalf of others too. So can you talk some about how to deal with both of those things?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the second. I always try to tell people, don't play the oppression Olympics. Okay. Which is, you know, my oppression is I get the gold medal in because I get oppressed way more than you but I think that's a very real thing that we all right. But then when you realize that some people they are oppressed in multiple ways, you know, you're Black, you're a woman, you're gay, or you're Black, you're a woman, you're trans, or you know, you could be white. You have multiple levels, and I think the one thing we have to recognize is that we are all complex beings, and we don't. There's not one single thing that covers all of our identity. And when you're taken into the complexity of our identity, like for myself, I'm Black woman, in these.
And Frozen.
And Frozen too, yes. Frozen 3, here we are. That's right. Camila, we're waiting. We're going to wait for you to come back in.
It states, but I'm.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I don't know what you heard.
Okay. You were chronicling. You're Black. You're a woman. Yes. Go ahead.
I'm Black. I'm woman. And you know, I'm Christian, but I'm also an educated woman, middle class. So there's a lot of privilege in the same time with my oppression. And I also trying to figure out how do you recognize that there's privilege and oppression in a lot of people's things. So recognizing my privilege, it is to me as a womanist and as a person who follows Jesus, I feel obligated to use the privilege I do have to speak upon the behalf of those who do not have such privilege, because there are a lot of other people who don't have the opportunity to speak in places that I have to speak or to say things that I can say. So I think it is imperative that you do use your privilege when you have privilege. But you also, I think, as to what Ray was saying earlier, recognizing our privilege and how privilege can be blinding. I think one thing that we a lot of times forget to do is to recognize our own privilege, because we get so caught up into what's going on in my life. But then there are a lot of areas that we are privileged, and we have to make sure that we're recognizing it and not othering people with our privilege.
Right. Elana, would you address some of the work that you do in promoting pluralism in this respect? Because we not only have a tendency to get stuck in our silos of, say, race or gender or sexual orientation or whatever the case may be, we also have a tendency to get stuck in our religious traditions, right? And so in the United States, in our history, for instance, Christianity has had a tendency to view itself as sort of the gatekeeper of religious conversation in America, notwithstanding the First Amendment, notwithstanding our ideals. But some of these problems are wicked enough that they require us, I think, to find ways to transcend and move out of our own religious silos. How have you been experiencing positive results in that, and what directions would you point us as we begin to work together in that respect?
Well, food always helps. That is of mutual interest across cultures. But
Yes.
So I'll give you an example. We have a day in the spring called Yom HaShoah, where we commemorate the Holocaust. And we decided to show our teens a documentary about a community in rural Tennessee that was studying the Holocaust,
Right.
so predominantly poor, white, and Christian. And they were trying to wrap their heads around what is 6 million. And so they decided to count paper clips and fill a room with paper clips to understand how many Jews had been killed. And they realized they needed to expand the project to be 13 million because it was not just Jews that were murdered by the Nazis in concentration camps. And it's a great documentary, and it shows how the children's eyes are opened and how people from all over the world start mailing paper clips to rural Tennessee to help the kids with this project.
Wow.
And we decided, since it was a project about 13 million paper clips, not 6 million paper clips, we wanted to invite local masjid, their teens, to watch the documentary with us and then have a discussion afterwards. So I had a connection with a masjid in Frisco, and the students gathered. And we finished watching the film, and I was trying to get the conversation going, and it was a little awkward. So I said, okay, let's take a step back. Why don't you share your name and where your family comes from? And the children from this masjid were predominantly from Pakistan. So they started telling the story, and they would say, well, my family's from Pakistan, but actually originally they were from India. And I said, okay, hold up. I don't think my teens know the story about what happened when India became its own country. And, you know, and so they started to share, well, yeah, when there was partition in India, my family had to flee across the border into Pakistan, and we had no time to pack, and we lost family members, and people were killed. And my teens said, wait, that's the story of my family too, but it happened in Europe. And so we got this common ground by through art, through film. So that's one example of how pluralism can work, is they realized a lot of humanity shares the same story.
Beautiful. A lot of the, sorry, Nancy.
Yeah, I'm curious about how we work, and I think there were some questions about this that came through. You know, how we work with people who really are invested in seeing the scarcity and thinking that, you know, we have to protect our community, our faith, our people, our neighborhood, and that we don't have the luxury of being so inclusive, that, you know, really our faith tells us that we need to take care of our own first, that, you know, that's really what, I mean, that's part of what they're hearing in their faith tradition, and that's what they're clinging to. And I think a project like the Paperclip project, and then the follow-up that Elana was able to create is an amazing experience. But how do we get people, you know, that's with young people and, you know, people who don't have their hand on the tiller of power and money and resources. How do we broaden this as a faith community? How do we get our faith voices to be as loud as those other faith voices that seem to be dominating the conversation?
I think gatherings and organizations like Faith Commons and Faith in Texas, which put progressive thought leaders together from across a variety of faiths to create some type of power. Now, Faith in Texas often talks about creating power, the idea that collectively, you add your few with my few, and I'll add my few with George's few, and he'll add his few with Camilla's, and so forth. And together, now we've got an amplified voice. It's really old school organizing. It's social movements and social mobilization 101. There are lots of theories of political science that talk about accessing one's government and how to make a petition. And it really is an exercise of collective power. Those with money and status access their government and ways and through opportunities the rest of us do not have. So it takes a collective effort. And bringing people to a room and having conversation and realizing that we have much more alike than we have different in many instances is a great place to start. And then helping to nail out an agenda that says these are the things that we are petitioning our government for, our state government, our county government, our federal government. And to be careful then not to repeat the mistakes of the past, because in past movements, like the women's movement as an example, white women had amplified voices, and so Black and brown and Asian women ended up in the late 60s, early 70s, creating their own organizations, i.e. womanism, because they didn't have a voice in those beginning protest movements. So if we are careful not to repeat the mistakes of the past, bringing everyone to the room, and when we're creating the agenda, to make sure we're doing it equitably, and that we have a focus on restorative justice, so that everyone's agenda item can be placed on the list, then I think that's a really good place to start.
I agree with Ray. I just want to add a couple things. I think what he said, but I think two things. We have to be intentional and strategic continuously in doing those things. I think we have to be very intentional as you come together. But I think the reason a lot of the voice is amplified for those that are not as progressive and saying the type of things you were saying is a lot of times they spend a lot more time being strategic than I think we do. I think we need to be more strategic, and we need to be more intentional in amplifying. But it has to be a continuous thing of what like Ray was talking about.
One of the things I'm learning in my community is avoiding shaming people and figuring out how to thread the needle so that I am persistent in my message about truth, justice, and compassion, and also persistent in my message of, and I'm your rabbi, and I understand we think differently, and I want to be able to continue this conversation with you, because if what they hear from me is, you're a bad person for the choices you're making, and we'll never get the opportunity over time and persistence to say, would you consider looking at the world through a different lens?
I think that leads to an interesting question, Elana, that you have opened up for us in that we're all perplexed at times as to how we can read the same scriptures and come to such different conclusions, right? This was famously something that Abraham Lincoln talked about, that North and South read the same Bible, and yet, and they say we worship the same God, and yet we have different visions of the world. So one of the perplexing things, I think, to people who are more theologically and politically progressive is, how do we make common cause with religious conservatives who do read the same scriptures, but see things differently? You began to talk about not demonizing them. beginning to, stay in communication with them. But beyond that, how do we get them to see that this matter of fighting oppression and working to welcome the stranger and to build a beloved community is something that's common cause for people of faith?
I think you find where you have common ground. So this issue that Nancy asked about, people are afraid if we defund the police, how will we be secure? You start by saying, hey, I want to live in a safe society too. I think it's really important that people feel safe walking down the street. And then you have a conversation about, tell me from your point of view why you think policing and jail works. And then you ask, would you be willing to hear my opinions too? Or would you be willing to hear a story from our faith tradition that shares the point of view that we want to live in a safe world, but disagrees with you about the method? That would be my suggestion.
I agree wholeheartedly about finding common ground. One of the examples that comes to mind is those who have been involved in the pro-life movement or anti-abortion movement. And in the early days, you had Catholics and Southern Baptists come together to create a very strong alliance. In other ways, at least in their faith and theology, they had very little in common. But they found common ground in that area. Not that that would be my issue of choice to organize around, but as an example, I think that highlights what Rabbi Elana is saying, is that I have learned that sometimes we learn our language and how to speak our theological language and our churchese, but that doesn't always translate into other sectors. An example of that is from the Black tradition, the African American tradition. It's a long-held kind of adage that the God of the people under the slave ship in chains is not the same God of the people above on the deck. So for centuries, for 400 years of being on this continent, Black folks have realized that our God, whether we call that God Jehovah or God or Yahweh or Allah or whatever name that groups of Black folks have called God over the years, we realize that sometimes we can look at the very same text, the very same tenets, and come to a very different conclusion from our white siblings. So the way to kind of bridge that gap is to try to find common language. And so if I was talking to evangelicals, I would say, okay, Jesus is Lord, right? Let's start there. And let's see what kind of common ground we can find so that we could find, even if we disagree on 99 other things, if we found the one thing that we could agree on. And another great example of that from the political realm is prison reform. When persons were really championing prison reform and criminal justice reform got with some libertarians on the Republican side and said, come on, let's talk about this. And then you had people like Paul Ryan and others in years past coming out, and the senator, what's the senator from Kentucky? Not McConnell, but what's his?
Well, it was Rand Paul.
Rand Paul, excuse me, also coming out, and other Republicans saying, yeah, you know what, this is overdue. We need to talk about that too. It was a way of disagreeing on 100 other things, but finding that kernel of agreement and working towards that end.
I do think, though, that in the end, people have to recognize that they're going to have to give certain things up. So, there was a question that came through about, how do we change the perspective of not just offering charity, but development of opportunity? Well, that only comes with real redistribution of resources. We have to think in defunding the police is only one aspect of that. I do think we're coming to start to organize and be more strategic. And I do think that's what some of the work of Faith in Texas is doing. And the the launch of this campaign is a step in that direction, because it kind of connects the dots between our own, unexamined biases and unexamined priorities and unexamined assumptions about how resources can and should be used, our own and others. So it addresses that in a personal way, as well as giving us a way to take a public action with others. There's going to be an element of creating paper chains and actually attending the, going to the county courthouse and leaving our chain and leaving this long chain to make a statement about how many people are interested in changing the system of oppression that has persisted. And, that's one, again, I encourage you to sign up for this and participate. It can take, you don't have to do it all on August 30th. Obviously, it's a lot of hours of action, but this is something that's going to take a long time. It's going to take hard work. We have to be willing to engage, not just on a philosophical level or even at the voting booth, which is going to be hard to get to as well, but on a personal level. What am I willing, if things are going to look different for anybody, things have to look different for me too. And am I really willing to accept that? And I think that goes to the theological idea that, change is part of the ongoing work of creation, that God intends for things to change. God doesn't intend for everything to remain the same, and that we're always going to have our work to do in the ongoing process of being in partnership and covenant with God.
So we're coming to the end of our time together, and I want to say that there have been some specific questions around police budgets and prison budgets and how these changes should take place in our community. And I just want to say that meeting that we're looking toward on August the 30th is a place where you can get more information and you can drill down deeper on that. Nancy and I were on a call this morning in which we were talking more about this matter. We really want to encourage people to recognize that the provocative language of defunding police is not intended by everyone to mean abolish the police. For some, that's the answer, and a suggestion even that has come through in the questions on our chat. But rather, what we're really talking about here is a recognition that we have not produced a safe and equitable and just Dallas by allocating 60% of our resources through our Dallas budget to public safety. And of that 60%, 90% of it goes to personnel costs, which is to say more police, more benefits, more protecting of those who are supposed to be policing us have not made us safer. And so the alternative is, where are you going to find the money in the budget to redistribute toward a different and more humane way of protecting our community? And the fact that we use the language of defund police means the shifting of resources from one thing to another, like mental health, like drug treatment, like addressing homelessness, like investing in previously disenfranchised communities in Dallas. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about that will transform Dallas. And if these things were to take place, what we believe is true is that it will not only be good for those who have been previously deprived, but as Nancy said, it will actually be good for all of us, because we will be neighbors truly. We will experience more liberation. Even those of us who have had privilege and wealth will learn what it's like to live with a sense of life as a gift, not a possession. So we hope that you'll be part of these future conversations and this program coming up on the road to liberation. Nancy?
Yeah, and I also want to In addition to encouraging you to sign up for the Road to Liberation, I want to call your attention to the 10 new directions for justice in Dallas, which has been put together in a format that's very clear and easy to walk through. I also would ask you to look at the Faith Forward Dallas Facebook page, where there'll be a lot of information about how to weigh in on the upcoming budget hearings for the city of Dallas. If you live in Dallas, there are going to be meetings taking place starting on August 13th through August 27th, where you will be have the opportunity to tell your city council people what you think about what the budget should prioritize in Dallas. There are also city council meetings starting on Wednesday, where you can do the same thing, sign up to speak. And all of these resources will give you the what you need to be able to sign up and speak effectively to these issues if you feel called to by your faith. So we encourage you to do that.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Nancy Caston, for helping to co-host this. Thanks to Faith in Texas as well. And a special thanks to the Reverend Camila Hall Sharp, to Reverend Ray Jordan, and to Rabbi Elana Zeleny for your wonderful contributions. It's great to be in this community with you and to share in common cause for the common good. God bless you all, and thank you for joining us, all of you who tuned in during this hour.
And thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.